Alpine was a dismal, distant last in F1 in 2025, but it ended the year with a dubious honour at the same time. It is unofficially the best-worst team in F1 history. Flavio Briatore's inglorious return has led Alpine to the very back of the grid, as Renault's F1 team finished in last place for the first time in the French manufacturer's F1 history, 48 points behind the next worst team. Even in its first year back in 2016, when Renault had repurchased a beleaguered and underfunded Team Enstone late the previous year and amassed a woeful 8 points, there were still 2 teams that finished behind. It's never been good enough for a manufacturer of this size to have spent a decade bouncing around the midfield with differing degrees of success, but it's never been this bad, and the decline across the ground effect era has been sharp. It's so easy to forget that in 2022, Alpine was celebrating 4th place in the first year of the new rules, and that finishing 4th meant Alpine bested McLaren on merit just 3 years ago. The fact McLaren has charged on to winning championships in this era while Alpine has gone in the completely opposite direction is the ultimate example of Alpine's missed opportunity and how disastrously it's been managed. That goes for Briatore, the calamitously interfering Alpine leadership of Laurent Rossi, and of course ex-Renault CEO Luca De Meo, who was ultimately responsible for this omni-shambles until the summer of 2025, even though he and his sycophants never acted like it. Briatore is still trumpeting a grand ambition in the short term, as he wants Alpine to be fighting for podiums as a Mercedes customer from 2026 onwards, and then start aiming for victories soon after. Optimism's great, but it has to be rooted in reality. And Alpine's is sobering. To fall from best of the rest to dead last in 3 years was a miserable way to end Alpine's time as a works team, given Renault's F1 engine program has been canned ahead of the new 2026 rules. That is a decision that the powers that be have gambled Alpine's entire competitive credentials on, and it will surely be an improvement because how could it be worse? No team has ever finished last while scoring as many points as Alpine has in 2025, hence us labelling it F1's best-worst team. The new scoring system, introduced in 2010, has obviously inflated tallies in general, but even when adjusting pre-2010 point tallies to the new system, nothing beats the 22 Alpine managed in 2025. And while its car was just about the slowest on average, the Alpine wasn't irredeemably bad, as its qualifying results show. Pierre Gasly's record of 11 Q3 appearances meant Alpine started in the top 10 in almost half the races. Plus, its single lap pace deficit of just under 1.4% is the smallest of the 21st century for the slowest car on the grid. This has continued a trend of F1's teams getting better across the board. F1 has become a much more sustainable and competitive environment of late, with the cost cap, tighter technical regulations and limits on aerodynamic testing. The worst is always relative, and Alpine's version of being F1's worst is the most competent a team in this position's ever been. But there's also a slightly strange contrast to note as well, because Alpine also achieved a historical first. It actually secured last place in the championship before the last race of the season. That's how far behind the next team it was, and how well every other team scored in 2025. Previously, any team rooted to the bottom of the points either had one or more others who were almost as bad, or at least had the vague mathematical possibility of a freak result launching them up the table. Alpine was so far off that even a 1-2 finish in Abu Dhabi wouldn't have moved it above anybody else. Ultimately, in the closest F1 season ever in terms of pace covering the 10 teams and an ultra-competitive midfield, Alpine's drivers just spent too many races without the machinery required to fight over a full race distance. Gasly scored 100% of the team's 22 points, amassed across just 6 weekends out of 24. This was barely a quarter of Alpine's 2024 total, and just 12.7% of what it scored at its 2022 peak. And rookie drivers Jack Doohan and Franco Colapinto contributed nothing, as they were thrown into an incredibly tough environment. Briatore's uncertain driver direction created unhelpful uncertainty, and the car limitations made for tough initiations as well. The main reason for such a painful year is inherently linked to why Alpine could get significant payback for enduring it. Alpine went all in on 2026 development, perhaps more than any other team on the grid. We'll get into the potential upside of that trade-off in a moment. This was actually rooted in an already disappointing 2024 season. Back then, the launch car was a disaster, and Alpine only salvaged 6th in the Constructors' Championship off the back of a sensational double podium in Brazil. It made genuine progress aerodynamically with its car in the second half of that year, but the key question was how much of a step would Alpine attempt to make with its car for this year, knowing that the 26 project was already well underway. The decision made was to start 2025 with as much aerodynamic progress as possible, but not waste too much resource on the bigger mechanical limitations from the 2024 car's front and rear suspension, so the focus was only on bringing a new rear end. While the 2025 car was decent in medium and high speed corners, it struggled more on slower tracks with bumps and a high curb riding demand. That wasn't helped by a Renault engine that was relatively weak on energy recovery. Fixing the problems of the 25 car ultimately took a back seat because by the end of January, development work on it had ceased. What amounted to a single aero package and some minor adjustments here and there didn't all appear until later in the year, but the car wasn't actively developed in season. It was simply about making the best of what Alpine had. And where this approach didn't work as hoped was that the grid as a whole was closer than anticipated. The leap from Sauber, for example, compared to last year, made the midfield more condensed and more competitive than ever. That knowledge wouldn't have changed Alpine's strategy, but it meant the team had to recalibrate its expectations from being a force in the midfield to resignation it was destined for last. After falling to the bottom of the pile after round 9 in Spain, Alpine stayed there. There was apparently nothing untoward about the way the car behaved. The car performed broadly as expected, the Spain floor upgrade worked as hoped, the car's vices were simply put down to known problems carried over from 2024. So yes, Alpine had a terrible season on track, but the true extent of its failure can only be fairly judged next year. Its own issues and the bigger picture plan, coupled with some teams even in the midfield continuing to develop quite deep into 2025, meant Alpine never had a chance of salvaging its season. And in a way, that's a source of some encouragement. Any resource used to improve the 25 car, particularly in terms of the limited aerodynamic testing allowed, unavoidably cost some progress on 26. So when Alpine saw teams like Haas bring a significant upgrade as late as October's United States Grand Prix, Alpine managing director Steve Nielsen described it as a warm feeling, as it means that team hasn't had its 2026 car in the wind tunnel as much as it could have. Normally, with a new set of rules, there's pretty sharp linear progress seen in the development being done. So the earlier a team gets on that line, the more progress it can make, assuming it maximises the chance and doesn't reach a plateau. And this is where F1's aerodynamic testing restrictions become relevant, because Alpine had more than many of its rivals across 2025 thanks to having a 6th placed allocation for the first half of the year before switching to the maximum allowance thanks to being last in the championship mid-season. It's not guaranteed that the extra resource conferred by the combination of the ATR allocations and the team's development strategy translates into more performance gained with the 26 car than its rivals. Plus, even teams that developed more in 25 will still have allotted the majority of their development resources to next year's car. But it has created an opportunity. Alpine has on paper a fantastic chance of being properly prepared for the 2026 rules, and the payoff has to be substantial to justify the low that Alpine's team members and drivers were put through in 2025. The question it can only answer with its competitiveness in 26 is whether it's capable of making the most of that approach in terms of its design and development work. Because while Mercedes should produce a better engine than Alpine's had so far, it would be naive to think an engine will fix everything that has held the team back. As recently as 2022, Team Enstone showed how well it can nail the start of a new rules era, but that's a long time ago in F1 terms. So a repeat just can't be taken on trust alone, especially given Renault's history of mismanagement with this team and the poor decisions by certain people put in place to lead it.